Let's separate fact from fiction about the Ebola virus. We're joined now from Bozeman in the U.S. state of Montana by David Quammen. He is the author of the New York bestseller, Spillover, Animal Infections in the Next Human Pandemic. David, thanks so much for joining us. Researchers think that Ebola, this outbreak, might be traced back to people actually eating fruit bats. Talk to us about this concept, which was also evidenced in Spillover.
Right. Well, this is what they call a zoonotic disease, Ebola, meaning that it's an animal infection that's transmissible to humans. The virus has to live somewhere between outbreaks because these outbreaks only occur every 3, 4, 5 years. Where is the virus in the meantime? It's in what scientists call a reservoir host. That's the animal somewhere in the forest in which the virus lives inconspicuously, permanently, and without causing symptoms. And then occasionally it spills over from that reservoir host and gets into humans. And then you have an outbreak. Now, the reservoir host of Ebola is still one of the great mysteries in infectious disease science. We don't know what that species is, but fruit bats are suspected. So it's a reasonable hypothesis, a reasonable inference that this outbreak might have begun with a person handling, perhaps eating, a large African fruit bat.
Interesting. We've been talking a lot about the research into an Ebola drug or vaccine. It takes decades. Let's assume doctors come up with some kind of medical breakthrough. Does that mean that Ebola could be wiped off the face of the earth forever? And will that drug work forever?
Well, we don't know whether the drug will work forever. It depends on how quickly the Ebola virus evolves, if they develop an effective treatment or a vaccine. In terms of wiping Ebola off the face of the world forever, you would have to find the reservoir host, and you'd either have to exterminate the reservoir host or you'd have to cure the reservoir host. This species of bat, or maybe it's a rodent, or maybe it's a monkey, we don't know. You'd have to deal with that. That's where the virus goes to hide. And I think it would be very problematic to say we're going to eradicate the Ebola virus either by curing all of the fruit bats in Central and West Africa or, God forbid, by exterminating all of the fruit bats in Central Africa. That would be a very bad idea because they have important roles in their ecosystem.
Sure, of course. It's a quandary. Well, the first major outbreak of Ebola was reported nearly 40 years ago, as you well know, and we have a graphic which shows the number of deaths caused by the virus since then. And here we are today with the deadliest outbreak of all time. More than 1,000 people have died, as you know. Someone who gets Ebola has basically a 50-50 chance of surviving. There are some viruses where the person who gets it is now immune from getting it again. Then there are others like the flu where different strains mean you could get it over and over and over again. If someone gets Ebola and survives, is it possible they could ever get it again?
You know, I've wondered the same thing, Mike, and as far as I know, that is unknown to the medical people, to the scientific people, because the experiment has never been tried. It would be important to know whether surviving a bout of Ebola confers lifelong immunity. But I think that the answer to that at this point is still unknown.
Yeah, well, let me ask you about the death toll. It's high. I just mentioned how high it is, over 1,000. But the percentage of deaths is actually lower than in previous outbreaks where it was almost a death sentence. I mean, like 90%. What's the reason for that, do you think?
Well, this is the particular strain or species of Ebola that they call Ebola Zaire. And you're right that in previous outbreaks of that kind of Ebola virus, the case fatality rates have been as high as 90%, but not always 90%. 90% is the worst case scenario. The whole range is from about 30% to 90%. Why this outbreak is running at about 54% now might have a lot to do with better treatment, better supportive care of the patients. Now, we've been hearing about this horrible crisis in these 3 countries for lack of expertise, lack of medical supplies, lack of the equipment and the infrastructure needed for proper medical care, and yet the circumstances there may be enough better than the old previous outbreaks to have lowered that case fatality rate from 90% or so to the low 50s. The alternative explanation is that the virus may have changed. The virus may be a little bit less lethal right now.
All right, David, it's a fascinating subject. You certainly enlighten us a great deal. We appreciate your time.